Hi everybody and welcome to today's video. We're looking at Act 3, Scene 3 and we're picking this up at about line 90. So if you haven't watched the first video on this scene, then I would go back and do that first before you look at this one, because this one will make a lot more sense if you've seen the first one. So I'm not going to go through the plot in too much detail here because I've done that in plenty of other places, but it'd be a really good idea for you to pause the video now and to look at each of the images on the screen and to work out which aspect of the plot each of those pictures represents. And of course we're at the final image here, which represents Iago whispering into Othello's ear, and this is Iago sowing seeds of doubt in Othello's mind, telling him that yeah, Desdemona's probably having an affair with Cassio. And in this part of the play, Othello really starts to believe what Iago's telling him. As always, we have a big question to think about in today's video. So we're considering how and why does Shakespeare present Othello's loss of control? And we'll see that loss of control continue throughout Act 3, Scene 3, kind of culminating in an epileptic fit in Act 3, Scene 4, and then obviously culminating again at the end when he murders Desdemona. Sorry for the spoilers there. So let's get started and have a look at this quotation. Now, what we looked at in the previous video was a conversation where Desdemona was saying, please will you reinstate Cassio as your lieutenant? And Othello says, I'll do whatever you want as long as you leave me alone for a little bit. And Desdemona says, okay, I'll be obedient, and she leaves the stage. And then we pick it up here, and Othello says, he bursts out, excellent wretch, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee. And when I love thee not, chaos is come again. Now, this is often presented as a sudden change of tone, particularly in modern productions of the play. Originally, though, excellent wretch would have been an ambiguous term, so it could be a term of endearment, but these days wretch is normally used to refer to someone that you really dislike, that you think is disgusting, that you really hate, and excellent is used to emphasise that. It's not necessarily a positive word here. So we're a long way from the exquisite lady that Othello loves so much, the gentle Desdemona that he describes earlier on in the play. Then he says, perdition, catch my soul. And perdition is a word meaning hell. So earlier on in the play, Othello has referred to heaven, and it's Iago in his soliloquies who refers to hell. You know, he says divinity of hell. But here, it's Othello who's referring to hell. So it's just interesting to notice the finer details and how Othello's language is changing as he becomes more and more convinced that Desdemona can't be trusted. And so he says, perdition catch my soul. You know, basically, my soul's going to go to hell. You know, but I do love thee. You know, whatever happens in our relationship, I love you, and that love might lead me to hell. So it's quite a different description of his love compared to what we saw earlier in the play. You know, we saw this description of my soul's joy in Act 2, and I keep talking about this quotation because it's such a resonant phrase. You know, that my soul's joy refers to Othello's understanding of love as being something that can transcend all of the earthly cares, that transcends all of the difficulties and the woes of life. It's an emotional and intellectual connection as well as being a physical connection. But here, we see perdition catch my soul. So we see the idea of the soul taken, echoed from earlier in the play, but twisted slightly. And this idea that actually maybe the soul isn't always going to be something good, but the soul can actually be damned as well. Then he says, when I love thee not. So this is the first hint in the play that there are occasions when Othello doesn't love Desdemona, when he doubts her loyalty. And this lack of love leads him to chaos. Now, we've seen chaos already in the play. We've seen it in the storm at the start of Act 2. We've seen chaos in the natural world. We've seen it in the conflict between Venice and Turkey. So we've seen chaos in the political world. And now we're seeing chaos in the personal world. But because Othello is the head of state in Cyprus at the minute, this personal chaos is going to filter out and become political and social chaos as well. So as Othello gradually loses control, he can't give proper instructions to people, he can't be the voice of order in society, and so society itself is at risk of breaking down around him. Now you can see I've put on the screen there a note to remind myself to link this to historical context, because the breakdown of society, the descent into chaos of society, was something that would be very familiar to Shakespeare's original audience. If you think about Queen Elizabeth I, who didn't marry and didn't have a child, there was a great amount of concern that after her death, England would be plunged into chaos because she wouldn't leave a clear heir to the throne. Of course, that was eventually resolved peacefully. King James came to the throne, but then we have events like the Gunpowder Plot. And again, we have this idea that maybe political control is actually quite chaotic. And if you think about that kind of chaos, that was caused by personal things. So Elizabeth I's personal choice or a personal situation, not having a child, then leads to a potential political destabilisation of the realm. Similarly, King James's personal religious viewpoint becomes politicised, and so personal choices are shown in history, but also in this play, as having deep, profound consequences in the wider realm. As well as that, what we notice in this quotation is a kind of collapsing of the iambic pentameter, of the blank verse that Othello's using. Now, I've spoken about blank verse before. Blank verse is where the speaker is talking in iambic pentameter, so you would expect to see around 10 syllables in each line. Those syllables will come in pairs that are called feet, and they will go da-dum, 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 for your 10 syllables. So if you think of a poem like Sonnet 29, I think of thee, my thoughts do twine and bud. So that's got 10 syllables, and it's I think of thee, my thoughts do twine and bud. You've got the stress on the second syllable in each pair. And what we see here is the use of enjambment and incisura, so that the punctuation halfway through the lines, that are disrupting the flow of that blank verse. And so even the structure of Othello's language, which was so elegant in Act 1, is breaking down here. And then if we progress through the scene, Othello says, is he, so is Cassio, not honest? And Iago echoes him, honest, my lord. Othello says, honest, aye, honest. Then Iago says, my lord, for aught I know, as in, how would I know? Othello says, what dost thou think? Iago says, think, my lord. And then Othello says, think, my lord, by heaven. This could be quite a comic scene, but it's kind of on the verge of being a little bit funny in terms of it being really clear that Iago is manipulating, suggesting, making a fool of Othello. But at the same time, it's profoundly distressing, because what we see is the Machiavellian villain twisting the psychological state of our tragic hero. And he's doing that because of his racism, because of his dislike of Othello being in charge of him, because of his desire for Desdemona, because of his anger that Othello might have slept with Amelia. All of these corrosive ideas are prompting Iago to I suppose we would call it gaslighting, to gaslight Othello's understanding of the situation. And this repetition is a really effective way of doing it, because Iago's not actually saying anything. He's not saying Cassio and Desdemona have had sex, but what he's saying is he's just making suggestions, putting ideas into Othello's head here. And then if we look at this section a little bit further on in the scene, Othello says, by heaven, thou echoest me. You're echoing what I'm saying, as if there were some monster in thy thought, too hideous to be shown. And this image of monstrosity is echoed all the way through the play, and it's generally associated with a loss of rational thought and increasingly destructive behaviour. If you think about all of the stereotypes of monsters that you have from reading fairy tales or from reading children's stories, anything like that, they're all playing in Othello's mind here. And this monster is a product of emotional anguish, and it's also connected with immorality. So, for example, in Renaissance iconography, monsters would appear in hell. So we also have other references to monster elsewhere in the play. And Iago mentions the green-eyed monster later in the scene. In Act 4, Othello echoes Iago. So it's not Iago echoing Othello later on, but it's Othello picking up Iago's language. And he says that a horned man is a monster and a beast. So a man who's been cheated by his wife becomes a monster. And we also think earlier in the play of Iago's comments of the monstrous birth of his plan in Act 1. So we have this idea of a descent into irrationality, destruction, self-destructive behaviour. As well as that, you need to be aware of the origins of the word monster. So it might derive from the Latin monstrare, which means to show. And Othello is obsessed at this point in the play with getting the visual, the ocular proof, he calls it, the visual proof of an affair between Desdemona and Cassio. And because he's seen them having this private conversation at the start of this scene, he thinks that he's been shown that bit of information. So this idea of showing what you can see with your own eyes is linked in with this idea of monstrosity, because Othello thinks he's seen something monstrous. Alternatively, monster might derive from the Latin monere, to warn. And again, I suppose here the concept of warning is quite important. Othello thinks he's being warned by Iago. We've got some other connotations as well, which you might want to tease out. The idea of lack of control. You know, a monster would lack control in terms of their own actions, but also humans lack control over monsters. We have the idea of unnaturalness, you know, as if there's something that's not, I suppose in inverted commas, normal or natural about monstrosity. And then that leads us to the question, what is monstrosity? And I suppose for the Renaissance audience, in many ways, and as Iago presents Othello in Act 1, Scene 1, Othello, because of his race, would have been conceived to have elements of monstrosity. Now, as a modern audience, that idea is absolutely repellent because it reflects the racism of the time. And in Act 1, Scene 2, what Shakespeare shows is that Othello isn't the monster. Actually, Othello is noble, he's got a great level of integrity, and Othello tries to explode all of those stereotypes which would have attached themselves to Othello because of his appearance. And what Shakespeare actually shows us that the real monster in the play isn't Othello at all, it's Iago. And so Shakespeare is pointing out to us that monstrosity is not necessarily to do with appearance, which is perhaps what the Renaissance audience would have thought, but it's to do with a psychological state. It's to do with your attitude towards others, your attitude towards society, and so on. So it might be a productive line of thought if you're talking about imagery of monsters in the play to think, actually, what would the Renaissance audience see as being monstrous? And what is Shakespeare saying about that? How is Shakespeare critiquing that and pulling that apart and trying to present a better understanding of humanity? And then slightly later on, we have Iago manipulating the truth. So he says, though I perchance am vicious in my guess, so perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps I'm being overly nasty in my suggestions about Cassio, as I confess it is my nature's plague to spy into abuses, and oft my jealousy shapes faults that are not. So he says that he's plagued by a kind of disposition to look really closely, to spy into what other people are doing, and that because he's jealous in himself, he often sees things and imagines things that aren't true. Now, this is really interesting because Iago is telling the truth here, but he's using that truth to manipulate Othello, and this is part of Iago's Machiavellian cunning. You know, he points out the obvious answer, but then he dismisses it. And then he says, oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. So again, he's warning Othello here. He's telling him the truth. Jealousy is a destructive idea, and it might lead you to wrong thoughts about Desdemona. So, oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. And notice the way he says my lord there. He's being very respectful when he speaks to Othello, even though he's very derogatory towards him behind his back. And then he says it is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. So we've got this image of monstrosity again. And then we have an image of appetite, which we find linked to Iago all the way through the play. And the idea that here he's saying that jealousy will consume you, which is exactly what happens to Othello. The jealousy consumes his integrity, his rationality, his nobility, and completely destroys it. So, summing up a little bit then, the function of this scene is quite important. It's a turning point in the play where Othello's anger and frustration is directed at Desdemona for the first time. And Iago directs Othello's thoughts towards a debased, all-consuming jealousy, and we see this descent into chaos. The seeds of jealousy are irrevocably sown, and Iago now has power over Rodrigo, Emilia, Cassio, and over Othello now. The scene also reinforces Desdemona's position as an innocent, naive, tragic victim. And it emphasises Othello's flaws, so his blindness, his lack of self-knowledge, his lack of understanding, his naivety, his readiness to trust the wrong people, his lack of character judgment. So Shakespeare reveals the disastrous consequences for the personal and political worlds if a leader lacks these traits. And the scene also reinforces the problematic nature of truth. So how can an individual discern, how can we work out what's true or false? Especially if we're presented with hard evidence. It's all down to interpretation, isn't it? Othello has seen Cassio and Desdemona together, but because of what Iago suggests, he misinterprets the scene, and we're going to see this motif of misinterpreting hard evidence again later on in the play. A little bit of independent learning for you then, just to consolidate your knowledge. We're about halfway through the play, and so it'd be a really good time to summarise your understanding of it. So what I suggest is that you make a table with the scenes listed down the side, a one-sentence summary of each scene, and then think about the function of the scene as I've just talked about on that last slide. And I've put an example here for Act 1, Scene 1. Okay, so I hope that that task is useful for you. I hope this video has been useful for you, and I look forward to seeing you for the next video where we'll look at the next section of Act 3, Scene 3.